4. Why does the phallus appear? 4.1. Grimaces of the real. The Phantom of the Opera, a spectroscopy. The coincidence of motifs between high art and theory and mass culture is today a theoretical commonplace, is not the clearest figuration of the famous Je hais un autre to be found in the mass culture tradition of vampires and living dead who decenter the subject, undermining from within his consistency and self-control. The main problem with this resonance, which is a constant from the outset of the modern to the relationship between postmodern theory and today's popular culture, is how to elude the notion of some common zeitgeist as its interpretive device. One way to avoid this deadlock is to take into account the antagonism which makes it possible to play high art and mass culture against each other, i.e., to interpret alternately one with the help of the other, as in Lévi-Strauss's Mythologique, in which myths interpret one another. Let us take the Phantom of the Opera, undoubtedly mass culture's most renowned spectre, which has kept the popular imagination occupied from Gaston Leroux's novel at the turn of the century, through a series of movie and television versions up to the recent triumphant musical. In what consists, on a closer look, the repulsive horror of his face. The features which define it are 4. 1. The eyes. His eyes are so deep that you can hardly see the fixed pupils. All you can see is 2 big black holes, as in a dead man's skull. To a connoisseur of Alfred Hitchcock, this image instantly recalls The Birds, namely the corpse with the pecked-out eyes upon which Mitch's mother, Jessica Tandy, stumbles in a lonely farmhouse, its sight causing her to emit a silent scream. When occasionally we do catch the sparkle of these eyes, they seem like 2 candles lit deep within the head, perceivable only in the dark. These 2 lights somehow at odds with the head's surface, like lanterns burning at night in a lonely, abandoned house, are responsible for the uncanny effect of the living dead. The first free association from the domain of high culture is here Edvard Munch's paintings from the same period, primarily his Spring Evening on Karl Johan, 1892, where the stream of ghost-like pedestrians move toward the spectator, their goggling eyes at odds with the death mask faces. 2. The nose. His nose is so little worth talking about that you can't see it sideface, and the absence of that nose is a horrible thing to look at. Is it necessary to recall how Freud, in his article on fetishism, uses exactly the same words to describe the horror of castration? What horrifies the child is the very absence of the penis, i.e., the fact that there is nothing to see where the gaze expects something. The corresponding feature in Munch's paintings, if we are to continue the homology, is the absence of nose and ears from the homunculus's head in his most famous painting, Scream, 1893. As to this point, there is an interesting divergence between Leroux's novel and the recent television miniseries on The Phantom. In the novel, the Phantom's primordial trauma was that, as a child, he was so ugly that even his own mother found him repulsive. When he approached her for an embrace, she pushed him aside with disgust and asked him to put on a mask. Whereas in the television series, nobody could stand his distorted face, with the exception of his mother, to whom he seemed nice and normal, and who constantly caressed his face, while entertaining him with her heavenly voice. This is why he is later obsessed with opera. He is desperately seeking the repetition of his mother's voice among the singers. Here, one has to avoid the pseudo-problem of which version is proper. They are to be read in the Lévi-Straussian manner, as 2 complementary versions of the same myth, which interpret each other. That is to say, what did his mother see on his face, in the second television version, that she found so irresistibly attractive, while the same feature was so repugnant to all others? There is only one answer possible, the exact opposite of the first version, i.e., an excessive phallic protuberance, repulsive to a normal gaze, in place of the nose. So to speak, the accomplishment of her maternal desire to obtain in her child her missing phallus, something resembling a famous case of the 18th century monster analysed by Alain Grosrichard. 3. The amorphous distortion of the face. The flesh has not yet assumed definite features. It dwells in a kind of pre-ontological state, as if melted, as if having undergone an anamorphotic deformation. The horror lies not in his death mask, but rather in what is concealed beneath it, in the palpitating skinned flesh. Everyone who catches sight of this amorphous life substance has entered the forbidden domain, and must therefore be excluded from the community. Therein consists the ultimate paradox of the living dead, as if death, the death stench it spreads, is a mask sheltering a life far more alive than our ordinary daily life. The place of the living dead is not somewhere between the dead and the living. Precisely as dead, they are in a way more alive than life itself, having access to the life substance prior to its symbolic mortification. Lacanian psychoanalysis locates the cause of this deformity in the anamorphotic gaze, i.e., the gaze sustained by an incestuous enjoyment. The anamorphotic distortion of reality is the way the gaze is inscribed onto the object's surface. One should recall here another case from the same period, that of the elephant man immortalized by David Lynch in the film of the same name. According to the mythology surrounding this figure, the grotesque protophallic protuberance on his forehead, the elephant's nose, as well as the general deformity of his body, designates the inscription of the maternal gaze onto the bodily surface. The myth of the elephant man goes as follows. During a circus parade watched by his pregnant mother, an elephant went berserk and almost trampled her down. This view from below on the mad elephant affected the mother and caused the elephant-like distortion of the embryo. Again, we encounter the same anamorphotic deformity of the face in a series of Munch's paintings, where the face seems to lose its contours and melt down into a whitish slime. Let it suffice to mention Ashes, Vampire, and The Kiss, 3 drawings in which, during sexual intercourse, or in its aftermath, the man literally loses his face. 4. The exceptional status of his voice. The Phantom of the Opera is first of all a being of voice. In the novel he is regularly addressed as the man's voice, as if the normal relationship of voice and its bearer, its source, were inverted. Instead of the voice appertaining to the body as one of its properties, it is the body itself which, in its distortion, materializes an impossible, originally bodiless, and as such all-powerful, all-present voice, baptized by Michel Chion as la voix acousmatique. The first association here is, of course, again Munch's scream. In it, the energy of the hindered scream, which cannot burst out and release itself in sound, finds an outlet, one is almost tempted to say is acted out, in the anamorphotic distortion of the body, in its unnatural serpentine windings, and of the coast and water beyond the bridge, as if these spiral lines are here to materialize sound vibrations, in a kind of effect of conversion of the hindered sound into a distortion of matter. The voice qua object. In his seminar on anxiety, 1960-61, unpublished, Lacan referred to Munch's scream in order to exemplify the status of the voice qua object. That is to say, the crucial feature of the painting is the fact that the scream is not heard. What we aim at here is not the obvious fact that paintings do not speak. There are paintings which are definitely resonant and call to mind sounds. The paintings of street scenes bursting with life, of dancing, of stormy nature, etc., whereas here, it pertains to the very essence of the depicted content that the scream we perceive is mute, since the anxiety is too stringent for it to find an outlet in vocalization. August Strindberg totally missed the point when he prattled on about how, in order to enjoy properly Munch's paintings, one should imagine appropriate music to accompany them. As we have already pointed out, this structural muteness is indexed within the painting itself by the absence of ears in the desperate homunculus's head, as if these ears, foreclosed from the symbolic reality of the face, return in the real of the anamorphotic stain, the form of which recalls a gigantic ear. In everyday language, one could say that the scream got stuck in the throat. The voice qua object is precisely what is stuck in the throat, what cannot burst out, unchain itself, and thus enter the dimension of subjectivity. It is by no accident that, in his four fundamental concepts, Lacan determines the object small a as the bone which got stuck in the subject's throat. If the exemplary case of the gaze qua object is a blind man's eyes, i.e., eyes which do not see, we experience the gaze qua object when a partner in conversation suddenly takes off his black glasses, exposing us to the uneasy, depthless white of his eyes. Then the exemplary case of the voice qua object is a voice which remains silent, i.e., which we do not hear. It should be of no surprise, then, that the most famous scream in the history of cinema is also silent. The scream of a mother who watches powerlessly, her son being shot down by soldiers, in the scene at Odessa's staircase from Eisenstein's battleship Potemkin. When, in a tracking shot, the camera approaches the mother who desperately grasps her head and almost enters the black hole of her open mouth, its entire effect is again based on the fact that we do not hear her scream, i.e., that it gets stuck in her throat, as in the above-mentioned scene from Hitchcock's Birds, where Mitch's mother, upon encountering the corpse with pecked-out eyes, utters her silent scream. To this silent scream, which bears out the horror-stricken encounter with the real of enjoyment, one has to oppose the scream of release, of decision, of choice, the scream by means of which the unbearable tension finds an outlet. We, so to speak, spit out the bone in the relief of vocalization. In Hitchcock's oeuvre, its most famous case is Doris Day's scream from the second version of The Man Who Knew Too Much, which, at the last moment, prevents the murder in Albert Hall. What one has to bear in mind here is the contrast between this scream and the silent mother's scream from Potemkin. They are both placed within the mother-son relationship. The silent scream manifests her resistance to cutting the umbilical cord that links her with the son, whereas the scream from The Man Who Knew Too Much signals that the mother, driven into the corner by a forced choice between her son and the community, renounced the child and chose the community. This scream is therefore, in its very coarseness, an act of civilization. In other words, the opposition of silent and vocalized screams coincides with that of enjoyment and other. The silent scream attests to the subject's clinging to enjoyment, to her unreadiness to exchange enjoyment, i.e., the object which gives body to it, for the other, for the law, for the paternal metaphor, whereas the vocalization, as such, corroborates that the choice is already made and that the subject finds himself, herself, within the community. The voice which obsesses the phantom is, however, not a scream, but a hypnotic operatic air. He falls in love with Christine after he recognizes, in her seductive singing, the resonance of the lost maternal voice. In The Man Who Knew Too Much, this incestuous song, which links the subject to the thing, the maternal body, i.e., by means of which the thing catches him with its tentacles, is, of course, none other than the notorious Que Sera Sera, sung by Doris Day in the embassy where her son is kept prisoner. It is, as said above, a song through which the mother catches her son, that is to say, a song which expressly establishes the incestuous umbilical link. Here, Hitchcock makes use of a formal procedure whose audacity has not yet been fully perceived. The camera directly tracks the voice, shows its resonance on the staircase, and its climb to the attic room where the son is locked up. Another crucial feature of this scene is the accentuated vulgarity and obscenity of Doris Day's singing. Her voice is far too noisy, so that the distinguished guests in the reception room avoid each other's gaze and stare down as if embarrassed by such an obscene exhibition. The third and final feature, not to be missed, is the song's content itself, which directly exhibits its superego status. Que sera, sera. What will be, will be. How could one avoid noticing, in this answer to the child's question as to what will become of him when he grows up, the malevolent indifference that pertains to the very notion of superego? This superego status is further confirmed if one locates Que Sera, Sera in the context of other Hitchcock films, as the middle term between Rear Window and Psycho. What we have in mind is, of course, a peculiarity of the Rear Window's soundtrack. When, Late in the evening, Grace Kelly approaches James Stewart, who is taking a nap on his wheelchair, first as an ominous shadow which overflows his face, then as herself. The background sounds, the rich texture of everyday noises, are suddenly suspended, and all we hear is the voice of an unknown soprano practicing scales, as if Mother is yet learning to sing, which is why she still tolerates the exchange of kisses between Stewart and Kelly. In The Man Who Knew Too Much, Mother already knows how to sing. Her voice finally reaches the son, the ultimate result of which is then shown in Psycho, a son dominated by the mother's voice, so that one is tempted to risk the thesis that the boy from The Man Who Knew Too Much is none other than Norman Bates in his childhood. In other words, the answer to the question, what will become of the boy from The Man Who Knew Too Much, is contained in Psycho. In order to avoid the danger of the so-called psychoanalytic interpretation of art, which lurks here, maternal superego as the secret of the voice stain, one has to accomplish the properly dialectical reversal of the explainans into the explanandum. The point is not to interpret the unfathomable acousmatique voice as the maternal superego, but rather its opposite, i.e., to explain the very logic of the maternal superego by means of this vocal stain. What we call maternal superego is nothing but such a voice which smears the picture and disturbs its transparency. Our procedure is therefore strictly allegorical. The mother, qua a diegetic personality, is ultimately an agency which, within the narrative content of Hitchcock's films, stands in for, holds the place of, a certain formal disturbance, a stain which blurs the field of vision. The scream and the song thus form an opposition. The status of the song is that of a stain which materializes incestuous enjoyment, whereas the scream is, to put it simply, a horrified reaction to this stain. A cursory glance at Munch's Scream reveals how its surface is drawn. The right half is far more anamorphotically distorted than the left half, i.e., the painting is sucked toward its center of gravity somewhere around 2/3 the height of its right side. The homunculus is seized with horror at being drawn into this whirlpool. The spiral lines of the distorted reality form a new shape vaguely remindful of a gigantic ear or eye, a kind of paranoiac agency which sees all and hears all. How not to recall here Syberberg's Parsifal, where the depth of the visual field, the background, is often filled out by a flat rear projection which deliberately destroys the effect of perspective and sometimes directly figures a gigantic eye, like the eye frescoes from Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, or, of course, the background with painted eyes in Salvador Dali's dream sequence from Hitchcock's Spellbound. In Hitchcock's Marnie, the same role of a fantasy element which patches up the hole, the blank in reality, is played by the gigantic black hulk at the end of the street where Marnie's mother lives. It is evidently drawn and thus destroys the depth effect. Therein consists the most elementary formal definition of psychosis, the massive presence of some real, which fills out and blocks the perspective openness constitutive of reality. This magnetic force which distorts the linear perspective on reality is, of course, enjoyment. Munch's Scream depicts the intrusion of enjoyment into reality. The more we approach its vortex, the more the painting loses its realist character, i.e., the more its spiral lines of color strike us with the weight of their material presence. The illusion of reality of the depicted content is thereby not simply undermined. It is far more appropriate to say that the depicted reality loses its free-floating ethereal character and becomes loaded with a kind of substantial density. Considering that, according to Lacan, the only substance ascertained by psychoanalysis is enjoyment, it is thus not difficult to conceive how the material weight of Munch's stains bears out the density of enjoyment. From the modernist Symptom. The standard designation by which Scream conveys anxiety is therefore appropriate, provided that we conceive the notion of anxiety in its strict Lacanian sense, i.e., as the affect which registers the subject's panic reaction to the over-proximity of the object cause of desire. The little man's features clearly recall a homunculus or a fetus, that is to say, a subject not yet torn from the mother's body. The same homunculus is depicted in the lower left corner of Munch's Madonna, 1895-1902, as part of the frame otherwise ornamented by spermatic trickles. The general conclusion to be drawn from it is that the stain, as such, has the status of the objet petit a, surplus enjoyment. Aside from Starlit Night, 1893, where the substantial mass of dark earth in the foreground directly evokes a blurred stain, the same effect occurs at its clearest in two paintings from the turn of the century, Girls on the Bridge, 1899, and The Dance of Life, 1900. The background earth and trees in the first case, the contours of the dancing bodies in the second, transmute into extended sperm-like stains which encumber reality from the substance of enjoyment. As to their status, these stains present therefore a kind of visual correlate to the voix acousmatique in the cinema, the voice which transgresses the boundary outside-inside, since it belongs neither to diegetic reality nor to the external vocal accompaniment, but lurks in the in-between space, like a mysterious foreign body which disintegrates from within the consistency of reality. On this basis, one could risk some passing general remarks concerning the relationship between modernism and postmodernism. The modernist procedure is that of a symptomal reading. Confronted with the totality, modernism endeavors to subvert it by detecting the traces of its hidden truth in the details which stick out and belie its official truth, in the margins which point toward what has to be repressed, so that the official totality could establish itself. Modernism's elementary axiom is that details always contain some surplus which undermines the universal frame of the official truth. What characterizes a typical modernist film is therefore the fact that its material texture, writing, in a way, tells another story, which, by means of its lateral links and resonances, redoubles and undermines the official story. An exemplary case of it is to be found in the excellent early Blake Edwards thriller Experiment in Terror, the story of a young bank teller, Lee Remick, victim of an asthmatic blackmailer. One of a multitude of motifs which resound in it beneath the official narrative line is the melancholic, inanimate gaze. First the gaze of the hanged woman hidden between the dolls, then the doll of a tiger with a sad face, a gift from the blackmailer to his lover's son. Although these elements have nothing whatsoever in common on the level of the official narrative, they nonetheless constitute the same symptom, the uncanny gaze which subverts the border between life and death, since it belongs to a dead object, corpse, doll, which nonetheless possesses a gaze of melancholic expressiveness. This gaze of a living dead is, of course, a metonymy of the status of the blackmailer himself, who functions as an acousmatique entity in Chion's meaning of the term. The horror of an all-present voice whose body all of a sudden emerges out of nothing. When, at the very end of the film, the police shoot him down in the empty, illuminated stadium, it is by no accident that the blackmailer, with his asthmatic wheeze, recalls a fish choking on dry land, out of its natural element. He is effectively like an octopus who, once out of water, loses its terrifying fascination and changes into a powerless slime. This is the fate which befalls the phantom-like acousmatique being as soon as it is reduced to its ordinary corporeity. How, then, does postmodernism subvert this modernist frame? Let us take a novel which, although still modernist, approaches the very border of postmodernism. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, a dystopian vision of the near future when, in the USA, the moral majority takes over and establishes a new state, the Republic Gilead, based on severe patriarchal order. Women are not allowed to read or write, etc. What we have here is ostensibly an extrapolation and thereby a clear condemnation of tendencies which are detectable in today's late capitalism, i.e., a kind of feminist version of 1984. Such a reading, obvious as it may seem, nevertheless misses the crucial point of the novel, the extraordinary libidinal cathexis of the scenes where the heroine, Offred, Fred's girl, alone in the room allotted to her in the master's house, gradually discovers material details of the objects around her, looks for the traces of past experiences inscribed in them, learns how to notice microscopic features of her body which have previously gone unnoticed. One is tempted to say that the novel was written in order to put in words this experience of discovering the material weight and density of our immediate surroundings, The ultimate function of the plot of the moral majority's coup d'etat is simply to serve as a narrative frame which impels the heroine towards such a microscopic experience, the same as with space operas, whose intermingled plots of planetary battles ultimately serve as a pretext for rendering the experience of floating freely in empty space without gravitation. The true feminine subject position thus comes forth not so much in the novel's official ideological content, the condemnation of moral majority rule, as in this attitude of microscopic probing, and the ambiguity of the novel is that in order to give expression to the feminine position, it must construct a grandiose fantasy of patriarchal totalitarianism. Here we have again the difference between meaning and what Lacan calls symptom. On the level of meaning, The Handmaid's Tale is a straightforward case of dystopia, depicting a possible new form of closed society. Yet this level is underpinned with the traces of feminine enjoyment. What is crucial here, however, is that this feminine writing cannot be staged directly, bypassing the circuitous route of meaning. It can be rendered only as a byproduct of the story whose official content is the totalitarian universe of the moral majority. The same dialectic is at work in Chandler's hard-boiled novels. The insipid view that Chandler took advantage of the detective narrative, using it as a frame that he filled out with a wealth of detailed observations and insights about the corruption of California-style wild capitalism and its psychic impact, overlooks the crucial fact that such detailed observations are artistically effective only as marginal byproducts of a text which officially purports to be a detective story centered on revealing the mystery of whodunit, etc. This precisely is the reason why The Handmaid's Tale remains a modernist novel. It would become postmodern the moment it posited an undercurrent of paradoxical codependence, complicity even, between this feminine writing and the totalitarian universe of the moral majority, introducing thereby a moment of ambiguity into its univocal condemnation. The step accomplished, among others, by Kafka, whose great novels are haunted with the secret complicity that links the bureaucratic thing, castle, court, to feminine enjoyment. To the postmodernist thing. What characterizes postmodernism is therefore an obsession with thing, with a foreign body within the social texture, in all its dimensions, that range from woman qua the unfathomable element that undermines the rule of the reality principle, Blue Velvet, through science fiction monsters, Alien, and autistic aliens, Elephant Man, up to the paranoiac vision of social totality itself as the ultimate fascinating thing, a vampire-like spectre which marks even the most idyllic everyday surface with signs of latent corruption. In this sense, one could say that today, more than ever, capital is the thing par excellence, a chimeric apparition which, although it can nowhere be spotted as a positive, clearly delimited entity, nonetheless functions as the ultimate thing regulating our lives. The ambiguity of the postmodern relationship to the thing pertains to the fact that the thing is not simply a foreign body, an intruder which disturbs the harmony of the social bond. Precisely as such, the thing is what holds together the social edifice by means of guaranteeing its phantasmatic consistency. Within modernism, the thing assumes either the form of remnants of the past, of the inertia of prejudices to be cast away, or the form of the repressed life power to be unchained, as in the naive psychoanalytic ideology of the liberation of drive potentials from the constraints of social repression. We enter postmodernism when our relationship to the thing becomes antagonistic. We abjure and disown the thing, yet it exerts an irresistible attraction on us. Its proximity exposes us to a mortal danger, yet it is simultaneously a source of power. One is even tempted to propose a reading of Schopenhauer and Marx as postmodern philosophers, insofar as perhaps the most distinctive feature of their thought is a radical hatred for its object, the will, interpreted by Schopenhauer as the secret of the Kantian Ding an sich, capital. Postmodernism thus accomplishes a kind of shift of perspective in relation to modernism. What in modernism appeared as the subversive margin, symptoms in which the repressed truth of the false totality emerges, is now displaced into the very heart, as the hard core of the real, that different attempts of symbolization endeavor in vain to integrate and to gentrify. In short, it is as if the universal and the particular paradoxically exchange places. What one encounters in the center instead of the universal is a kind of particular absolute, to use Jacques-Alain Miller's term, a particular traumatic kernel, while the various universals are all of a sudden reduced to the role of species of an impossible, unfathomable genus, i.e., they start to function as a series of specific, ultimately failed attempts to symbolize, transpose into the medium of symbolic universality, and thus to neutralize the traumatic core of the real. The theoretical antagonism thus shifts from the axis imaginary symbolic to the axis symbolic real. The aim of the modernist symptomal reading is to ferret out the texture of discursive symbolic practices whose imaginary effect is the substantial totality, whereas postmodernism focuses on the traumatic thing which resists symbolization, symbolic practices. This shift comes forth exemplarily apropos of Foucault's profoundly modernist treatment of the relation between sexuality and sex. In what consisted the reversal in their relation that exerted such fascination on the theoretical public? Instead of reducing sexuality, i.e., the series of discursive, legal, medical, ethical, economical, etc., practices in which sex is actualized, to the external secondary effect of a unique cause, sex qua substantial entity, Foucault conceived sex as the effect of this series of practices. Sex is not an object given in advance prior to its discursive actualizations and guaranteeing their consistency. It comes to be as a constructed, unique reference of these practices as a result of their hegemonic articulation. The notion of sex made it possible to group together in an artificial unity anatomical elements, biological functions, conduct, sensations, pleasures, and it enabled the use of this fictitious unity as a causal principle. From the Lacanian perspective, however, Foucault overlooks here the inherently antagonistic status of sex, the antagonistic relation between sex and sexuality qua plurality of discursive practices. These practices endeavor again and again to integrate, to dominate, to neutralize sex qua traumatic core, which eludes their grasp. Sex is therefore not the universality, the neutral common ground of discursive practices which constitute sexuality, but rather their common stumbling block, their common point of failure. In other words, sex pertains to the register of the real. It is an effect of sexuality, of symbolic practices, but its antagonistic effect, there is no sex prior to sexuality. Sexuality itself produces, secretes in all the meanings of the term. Sex as its inherent stumbling block, the same as with the notion of trauma and psychoanalysis, which is a retroactive effect of its failed symbolization. Therein consists the ultimate paradox of the Lacanian notion of the cause qua real. It is produced, secreted, by its own effects.